So now that we're finished with vitamins, minerals, and supplements, we're going to start what seems to be the student's favorite part of the semester from here on out. So we're going to start with energy balance, obesity, and fad diets, starting with energy balance. So energy balance is actually the amount of energy consumed, and remember, energy is measured in units called calories, so the amount of energy or calories consumed relative to the amount of energy or calories expended, or some people call that calorie burning. So calories in compared to calories out. So how do we expend energy? How does the body expend energy? Well, the most variable component of energy expenditure is activity, physical activity. Some people expend a lot of energy in physical activity, and some people expend very little. I know with me, with this change in lifestyle, with the sheltering at home, now that I can't go to the gym, which is where I prefer to perform my physical activity calorie expenditure has dropped significantly. So I'm going to be needing to make some adjustments about that. But this is the part of energy expenditure that you have the most control over. Now, another way that the body burns energy is through basal energy expenditure. Some people call this the basal metabolic rate. That's the energy that the body burns at rest to just keep you alive, just to keep body processes going, like breathing, the heart beating, blood circulating. So it's just to keep the body alive, not energy expended while moving. In fact, you can measure basal energy expenditure. When you do measure it, you measure it just upon wakening, when the person is still in bed, actually, or at rest. So this basal energy expenditure represents the largest number of calories that's burned by most people. Now, there are exceptions, like elite athletes sometimes burn tremendous amount of energy. I remember Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer, he expended 12,000 calories a day in activity, in his training, whereas most people expend somewhere between 12 and 1,600 calories a day through basal energy expenditure. So for most of us, most of our energy expenditure is in the form of this basal energy expenditure, and activity, is variable, and you can burn a significant number of calories in activity. For most of us, activity isn't the primary way we expend energy, it's the basal energy expenditure. Another way that the body burns energy is through the thermic effect of food. It actually requires some calories to digest, absorb, and metabolize the nutrients in a meal, or the food in a meal. That burns a small amount of energy, maybe about 200 calories a day. Thermogenesis is another way you burn calories, and thermo means heat. So Genesis means generating. So this is a way that the body actually generates heat, and when you generate heat, that burns some energy. So this is the energy burned to keep the body warm. So like I said, energy is burned off as heat. It wastes calories. And people with high degrees of thermogenesis tend to be lean. There are some people, you may know of some incredible eating machines, as I call them, who eat and eat and eat tons and tons of calories but never seem to gain weight. They just kind of burn off the excess through thermogenesis. We'll talk about that more in the obesity section when we talk about brown fat. So the energy balance components, calories in via dietary intake of energy, calories out via basal metabolism or basal energy expenditure, physical activity, the thermic effect of food, and thermogenesis. So in theory, they found by actually analyzing the calories in human body fat that 1 pound of human body fat has 3,500 calories. So we used to say that if you could decrease your calorie intake by 3,500 calories or increase your energy expenditure by 3,500 calories, you would lose a pound of body fat. and vice versa. But that turns out not to be the case. The body doesn't pay attention to that equation, as it turns out. So in reality, the body is actually really dynamic, and no two bodies are alike. The body has compensatory mechanisms to maintain a set point weight range that's largely genetically determined. So what happens is if you restrict calories over the long term, the body will adapt by lowering the calories burned at rest, and the body will adapt by decreasing the amount of calories burned with the same physical activity. Also, if you restrict calories and lose weight, it doesn't take as much energy to move a smaller body. So you'll burn fewer calories if you restrict calories over the long term, especially if it's a severe restriction, and you end up with a smaller body. Also, if you overeat, to a certain extent, thermogenesis will increase, and that can protect against some weight gain. This is what happens in those incredible eating machines who stay lean. These processes can be overridden. The body is much better at protecting you from starvation or adapting to a low intake than it is to adapting to an excessive intake of calories. So we'll go over again obesity in the next section, but this is what weight loss will actually look like if a person restricts their calories by the same amount. Say they calculate the energy that they need to maintain their weight and reduce their calorie intake by 500 calories a day. In theory, 500 calories a day times 7 days a week, that's 3,500 calories. They should lose a pound a week. But that's not what happens. You can see that this person in this graph over time is losing weight at a pretty steady rate, and then over time the body adapts and the weight loss actually slows down. So basal energy expenditure is sometimes, like I said, referred to the basal metabolic rate or resting energy expenditure. Because really for basal, you would have to measure the person's metabolic rate right when they woke up in the morning before they got out of bed. And that's just not possible in a real life. So we measure people's resting energy expenditures. They come to the lab and we have them lay down in a thermal neutral environment, not too hot, not too cold, and wait till their body comes to as close to a resting state as possible. Basal energy expenditure is defined as the minimum amount of energy that's needed to keep the body alive. Okay, so it accounts for 60-70% of your total energy needs depending on your physical activity level. Like I said, Michael Phelps is an outlier. It includes the energy needed for, like I said again, heartbeat, blood pressure, or keeping your circulation going, breathing, and maintaining your body temperature. So this basal energy expenditure varies between people. So things that influence the basal energy expenditure, first, how big you are, or your body surface area. Bigger people have higher basal energy expenditures than smaller people because they have more body to maintain, so that makes sense. Gender, males have higher basal energy expenditures than females. Some of that's explained by the fact that they have larger bodies in general, and larger lean masses. So lean mass is the next thing that influences the basal energy expenditure. Lean tissue is more metabolically active than fat tissue. So lean tissue is pretty metabolically active. Brain and liver actually have high energy needs for maintenance, but you can't really do anything to influence your brain and liver size. But the lean tissue that you can increase is your muscle mass. So increased muscle mass will result in an increased basal energy expenditure because muscle takes a lot of energy to maintain at rest. Not as much as brain and liver, but it does take a lot more energy to maintain at rest than fat tissue. Body temperature affects the basal energy expenditure. Fever increases the basal energy expenditure. So people who are sick and have, fevers, they need more calories. Unfortunately, a lot of times when you're sick, you don't feel like eating. That's one of the reasons that we recommend people who are sick consume something like a sports drink to replace electrolytes and provide some energy in the form of calories when they don't feel like eating, in the form of carbohydrates rather. Thyroid hormone also increases the basal energy expenditure. So people with hyperthyroidism, that is overactive thyroid glands, will produce more thyroid hormone, and they will have a higher basal energy expenditure. They tend to lose weight. People with hypothyroidism secrete less thyroid hormone, they have lower basal energy expenditures, and they tend to gain weight. So people with thyroid disease either take medication, thyroid hormone replacement, if they're hypothyroid, to have normal levels of thyroid hormone, or if they're hyperthyroid and have something like, say, the disease Graves' disease, a lot of times they have to have either their thyroid removed or irradiated to reduce the amount of thyroid hormone produced. I happen to have thyroid disease. I have the very common hypothyroidism called Hashimoto's disease. It's an autoimmune disease. And when it's not controlled, I tend to gain or lose weight. Just so happens that last year I had to change medications due to insurance, and I was over-medicated on my thyroid hormone with the same dose on a different type of medication, and I dropped 20 pounds over a period of about 6 months. And although, it seemed, most people are happy with weight loss, I felt terrible. So I went in and had an adjustment in my medication, and glad to say that my weight has recovered. Age influences the basal energy expenditure. As you get older, your basal energy expenditure drops. Some of that starting at about age 30, 2% per decade. Some of that is explained by the loss of lean mass as you age. So, resistance training to maintain muscle mass can somewhat offset that, but there's other factors associated with aging that seem to decrease the metabolic rate as well. Calorie intake, like I mentioned before, if you have a calorie deficit or a low calorie intake, your body tries to compensate for starvation, to protect you against starvation by lowering the basal energy expenditure, okay? Again, like I said, some people, when they overeat, thermogenesis increases, and that will help them minimize weight gain, but those mechanisms, can be exceeded. Remember when we talked about protein malnutrition, we talked about starvation and how the body adapts, and one of the adaptations to starvation is to lower the metabolic rate. When we talk about obesity, we'll talk about energy restriction is necessary for weight loss, but you don't want to restrict energy intake too much, or else the metabolic rate will drop more dramatically. So this is just a concept check. Who would have the higher basal energy expenditure? My friend with the mullet, Don, or the guy on the right? Okay. If you said Don has the higher basal energy expenditure, you would be right. So here is Muggsy Malone, the guy on the right, and Manute Bol, former professional basketball players, on the left. Who would have the higher basal energy expenditure? Well, in that case, it would be Manute, because he has a larger body, more body to maintain. This one, who would have the higher basal energy expenditure? The little girl who's well-nourished on the left, or the little kid who is clearly not getting enough calories and is malnourished on the right? Well, the little girl on the left would have the higher basal energy expenditure. Okay, so I'm going to stop this for now because it's almost 15 minutes, and then we'll start the next video on how you measure basal energy expenditure.